I don't care what your job title says. Who fixed my system? Victoria Hale's voice cut through the empty executive floor at 2:17 a.m., sharp enough to make even the night security guard freeze in place. Because just seconds earlier, every screen in her multi-million-dollar company had gone from total blackout to fully operational in a way her senior engineers had failed to achieve for the past 6 hours. And now standing in the glow of a restored control panel was a man in a gray janitor uniform, holding a cleaning cloth in one hand and a screwdriver in the other, as if he had simply wandered into a miracle by accident. But Daniel Carter knew better, because nothing about this moment was luck, not the timing, not the risk, and definitely not the consequences that could follow if he had been wrong. And as Victoria stepped closer in her tailored navy blazer, eyes locked on him with a mixture of suspicion and disbelief, Daniel felt the weight of everything that had led him here pressing down on his chest, the unpaid bills stacked on his kitchen counter, and the promise he made to his daughter Emily that morning over a rushed breakfast of toast and peanut butter that things would get better even though he had no clear idea how. Because less than 24 hours ago, he had been standing in the same building, but invisible to everyone. Just another night cleaner assigned to wipe down desks and empty trash bins while avoiding eye contact with employees who barely acknowledged his presence. And earlier that evening, one of the supervisors had warned him in a flat, dismissive tone that if he so much as touched anything outside his assigned duties again, he would be replaced by the end of the week, a warning that still echoed in his mind as he looked at the ceiling, and now staring directly at him, waiting for an answer he wasn't sure he was allowed to give, because Daniel wasn't supposed to understand systems like this, wasn't supposed to notice the inefficiencies in their infrastructure, wasn't supposed to quietly observe patterns in error logs while pushing a mop across polished marble floors. But he did, and he couldn't turn it off, not even when it would have been safer to stay quiet, and especially not when, just an hour earlier, he had overheard two panicked engineers arguing about a cascading failure that was costing the company thousands of dollars every minute, their voices tense as they admitted they had run out of solutions. And that was the moment something inside Daniel shifted, because he recognized the problem instantly. Not from this job, but from a life he no longer talked about. A life where he had once been the person people called when things broke, before everything fell apart, and he had to start over from nothing. And so he made a choice that could either change everything or end the only income he had left. He waited until the floor was empty, until the hallway lights dimmed, and the building settled into that quiet hum of late-night operations. And then he stepped beyond the line he had been warned not to cross, approaching the terminal with steady hands and a racing heart, telling himself he would just take a look, just confirm his suspicion. But one look became one adjustment, and one adjustment became a series of precise corrections that felt almost automatic, like muscle memory he thought he had lost. And within minutes the system began responding, slowly at first, and then all at once, screens flickering back to life across the building like a chain reaction. And now here he was, standing face to face with the one person whose opinion could either erase him or redefine him completely. As Victoria Hale waited, arms crossed, expecting an explanation, and Daniel realized that for the first time in a long time, being invisible was no longer an option. Daniel did not answer right away, not because he did not have an explanation, but because he understood exactly how this looked. A janitor standing in front of a system that senior engineers could not fix, with access he was never supposed to have. And for a brief second, he considered saying nothing, walking away, pretending it was not him. But Victoria Hale was not the kind of person who let silence pass as an answer, and the way she held his gaze told him she had already decided he was involved. I asked you a question, she said, calmer now, but somehow more intense. And Daniel slowly set the screwdriver down on the edge of the console, careful, deliberate, as if any sudden movement might make the moment collapse. The system was looping on. A failed authentication protocol, he said, his voice steady but low. And for the first time Victoria's expression shifted, just slightly, not disbelief this time, but recognition, because that was not something a random cleaner would say. Your backup server kept rejecting valid requests because of a time sync drift. It was small, less than a second, but enough to break the chain, he continued. And now the silence between them felt different, heavier, like something was being recalculated in real time. Victoria stepped closer, close enough to see the faint wear on his uniform, the kind that came from long hours and hard work, but also the way his eyes stayed focused, not nervous, not guessing, but certain. "And you fixed that," she said, not as a question but as a test, and Daniel nodded once. "I forced a manual resync and rerouted the verification path until the system stabilized," he replied. And somewhere behind them, one of the monitors pinged softly, confirming what she already knew. The system was not just back, it was running cleaner than before, and that was the part that made no sense, because even her top engineers had not been able to optimize it like this under pressure. Victoria crossed her arms again. But this time it was not defensive, it was analytical. "What were you doing touching that system in the first place?" she asked, and there it was, the line he had crossed, the rule he had broken, the reason he could still lose everything despite what he had just done. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I heard your engineers talking earlier," he admitted. "I recognized the issue." And for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, because people do not recognize problems like that unless they have seen them before, unless they have lived in that world, and Victoria was too sharp to miss it. "You recognized it," she repeated, studying him now, not as a janitor, but as a variable that did not fit, and Daniel hesitated, not because he wanted to lie, but because telling the truth meant reopening a part of his life he had spent years trying to move past. "I used to work in systems engineering," he said finally, the words sounding distant even to him, like they belonged to someone else, someone he used to be. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, not in doubt, but in curiosity. "Used to," she echoed, and Daniel gave a small nod. "A long time ago," he added, and he did not elaborate, not about how quickly things can fall apart, not about how one mistake, one loss, can push someone from conference rooms to cleaning them after hours, and for a few seconds neither of them spoke, the quiet hum of the building filling the space between them, until Victoria turned her head slightly toward the row of glowing monitors, then back to him, and when she spoke again, her tone had changed, less like an interrogation and more like a decision forming. "Do you have any idea how much money you just saved this company tonight?" she asked, and Daniel shook his head. "No, ma'am," he said honestly, because numbers like that had not been part of his world for a long time. Victoria let out a slow breath, almost a quiet laugh, but without humor. "More than your annual salary. Probably more than 10 times that," she said, and that landed, not as pride, but as pressure, because suddenly this was not just about breaking a rule. It was about value, and value changes how people are seen, how they are treated, how they are remembered. Victoria uncrossed her arms and stepped even closer, now fully in his space, her presence direct, unmistakable. "Daniel, right," she said, glancing briefly at the name stitched onto his uniform, and when he nodded, she continued, "Starting right now, you are not going back to pushing that mop until I understand exactly who you are and why. Someone with your skills is working a night cleaning job in my building." And just like that, the ground beneath Daniel's life shifted again, not because he had planned it, not because he had asked for it, but because for the second time in less than a day, someone had forced him out of the role he had been hiding inside, and this time, there was no stepping back into the shadows. Daniel stood there for a moment after Victoria finished speaking, as if his body had not yet caught up with what his ears had just heard, because being told not to go back to pushing a mop was not the same as being given a second chance, and he had learned the hard way that moments like this could disappear just as quickly as they appeared. "I still have a shift to finish," he said carefully, not defiant, not submissive, just grounded in the reality he knew. And Victoria studied him again, this time with something closer to curiosity than authority. "No, you do not," she replied, her tone calm but final, the kind of tone that did not invite negotiation, and for a second Daniel almost argued, almost said that he needed the hours, that he could not risk losing this job, but something in her expression told him she already understood that part, and had already decided it did not matter. "Come with me," she added, turning without waiting to see if he would follow, and after a brief hesitation, Daniel did, leaving behind the cart, the mop, and the version of himself that had been defined by them. As they walked through the quiet hallway toward the executive offices, the contrast felt almost unreal. The same building he had cleaned every night now looked different under the bright overhead lights, not distant, not unreachable, but suddenly close enough to step into. Victoria pushed open a glass door leading into a conference room overlooking the city, the skyline stretching out in the distance with scattered lights still glowing against the dark sky, and she gestured for him to sit. But Daniel remained standing for a moment, unsure if he belonged in a place like this, until she gave him a look that made it clear this was not optional, and slowly, he took a seat across from her, the chair. Softer than anything he had sat in for a long time. "Start from the beginning," she said, folding her hands on the table, her attention fully on him now, and Daniel let out a quiet breath, because there was no simple version of his story, no short explanation that could bridge the gap between who he had been and who he appeared to be now. "I used to work for a mid-sized tech firm in San Jose," he began, choosing his words carefully, "systems architecture, mostly back-end infrastructure, and as he spoke, his voice shifted slightly, more natural, more certain, like stepping back into a language he had not used in years. Victoria listened without interrupting, but her eyes stayed sharp, catching every detail, every hesitation. "What happened?" she asked after a moment, not impatient, but direct, and Daniel looked down briefly at his hands, noticing the faint calluses that had not been there before, a physical reminder of how far he had fallen from that world. "My wife got sick," he said quietly, and that was where everything changed, not suddenly, but steadily. The hospital visits, the bills, the missed work, the opportunities that slipped away one by one until there was nothing left to hold on to. "I tried to keep both going," he continued, "the job and taking care of her, but eventually I had to choose." And he did. Not need to explain which one he chose, because the answer was written in everything about him now. Victoria's expression softened, just slightly, not sympathy exactly, but understanding. "And after," she prompted gently, and Daniel swallowed. "After she passed, I had my daughter, Emily," he said, and there it was again, that anchor in his life. The reason he kept moving forward even when everything else had stopped making sense. "I took whatever work I could find," he added. "This was stable." And the word stable carried more weight than it sounded like it should, because stability meant rent paid, food on the table, a routine his daughter could depend on, even if it meant disappearing into the background of someone else's world every night. Victoria leaned back slightly, absorbing everything. The room quiet except for the faint hum of the building, and for the first time since this started, she did not look like a CEO evaluating a problem. She looked like someone reconsidering an assumption. "You walked away from that entire career," she said, more to herself than to him, and Daniel shook his head once. "It felt like it walked away from me," he replied, honest, not bitter, just stating a fact as he had come to understand it. And that answer lingered in the air between them, because it said more than a longer explanation ever could, and Victoria slowly nodded, as if something had just clicked into place, not just about him, but about the situation she was now facing. Because this was no longer about a janitor who broke a rule. This was about a skilled professional hidden in plain sight. And as she looked at Daniel again, there was a new kind of focus in her eyes, not curiosity this time, but intention, the kind that meant whatever happened next was not going to be accidental. Victoria did not respond immediately after Daniel finished speaking, and that silence felt different from the ones before, not uncertain, not questioning, but measured, as if she was recalculating something far bigger than just the situation in front of her, her fingers lightly tapping once against the table before going still again. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet decisiveness that made Daniel sit a little straighter without realizing it. "Do you know what my senior engineers did tonight?" she asked, and Daniel shook his head slightly, not because he had not seen the chaos, but because he understood this was not really a question about facts. "They followed protocol," she continued. "They checked every approved pathway, every documented solution, and when those failed, they stopped." And she leaned forward just enough for the point to land. "You did not." And that difference hung in the air between them, because it was not just about skill. It was about instinct, about the willingness to step outside what was safe when something truly mattered. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, not uncomfortable, but aware that this conversation was moving somewhere he had not prepared for. "I broke your rules," he said plainly, not trying to soften it. And Victoria gave a small nod, acknowledging the truth without dismissing it. "Yes, you did," she said. And if you had been wrong, this conversation would look very different. And there was no threat in her tone, just clarity, the kind that made it clear she valued results but did not ignore risk. But you were not wrong, she added, and that was where the balance shifted, because being right changes the weight of every decision that led to that moment. She stood up then, walking slowly toward the glass wall overlooking the city, her reflection faintly visible against the night skyline, and Daniel remained seated, watching her, unsure whether to speak or wait. And after a few seconds, she continued, not turning around. "Do you know how many resumes I reviewed last quarter for senior system roles?" she asked, and again, Daniel did not answer. "Over 200, she said. All qualified, all experienced, all following the same patterns." And now she turned back to face him. "None of them were in my building tonight when I needed them the most." And that was not frustration. It was something sharper, something more focused, because what she had just seen could not be found on paper, could not be filtered through a hiring process. It had to be witnessed, and she had witnessed it. Daniel felt a shift in the room, subtle but undeniable, like the conversation had crossed an invisible line. "What are you saying?" he asked carefully, and Victoria walked back toward the table, stopping just short of where he sat. "I am saying that I do not believe in wasting resources," she replied, her tone steady. "And right now, you are the most underutilized resource in this entire building." And that statement landed with more weight than any compliment could have, because it was not praise, it was an assessment, one that carried implications Daniel was not sure he was ready to face. "I have a team coming in at 8 a.m., she continued. "People who are going to ask questions, review reports, and try to understand what happened tonight." And she held his gaze, making sure he understood what came next. "You are going to be in that room." And for a brief second, Daniel thought he had misheard. Because the idea of sitting in a meeting like that, not as a cleaner passing through, but as someone expected to speak, to explain, to contribute, felt almost unreal. "I am not on your payroll for that," he said, the practical part of his mind trying to catch up. And Victoria gave the faintest hint of a smile, not amused, but certain. "That can change," she said simply, and there it was, not an offer spelled out, not a contract, but a door opening in a way that was both clear and undefined at the same time. Daniel looked down briefly, processing everything, the risk, the opportunity, the responsibility that would come with stepping back into a world he had left behind. And for a moment he thought about Emily, about the promise he made, about the version of himself she believed in even when he did not. And when he looked back up, Victoria was still watching him, not impatient, not pushing, just waiting to see what he would do with the chance she had placed in front of him. Because in her mind, this was no longer about what he had been, it was about what he was willing to become next. Daniel did not answer right away, not because he was unsure, but because he understood that whatever he said next would not just affect him, it would reshape everything about his life moving forward. And that kind of decision was not something he took lightly anymore, not after everything he had been through. He glanced briefly toward the glass wall, where the faint reflection of the city still shimmered against the night, and for a moment his mind drifted to a small apartment across town where his daughter Emily would be asleep, unaware that her father was standing at a crossroads he had not expected to face again. "What happens if I walk into that room, and they do not want me there?" he asked finally, his voice calm but honest, and Victoria did not hesitate. "Then they will learn very quickly that I do," she replied, and there was no arrogance in her tone, only certainty, the kind that came from someone who was used to being the final decision in any room she entered. Daniel let that sink in, because it was not just support, it was protection, and he had not felt that in a professional sense for a very long time. "And if I am wrong," he added, not looking away from her, "if what I did tonight was just luck?" And that question mattered more than anything else, because deep down, after years away from that world, even he had wondered if his skills still held the same weight. Victoria stepped a little closer, her expression steady, focused. "Then we will find out," she said. "But I do not make decisions based on luck, and neither should you." And that response landed differently. It did not reassure him in a comforting way. It challenged him. It forced him to confront the possibility that what he did was not an accident, that maybe he had been underestimating himself for far too long. The room fell quiet again. But this time it was not heavy. It was clear, like the moment before a decision is made, and Daniel slowly nodded, not dramatically, not with hesitation. Just a simple acknowledgement that he was stepping forward. "All right," he said, and with that one phrase, something shifted permanently, not just in the situation, but in how he saw himself. Victoria gave a small nod in return, as if she had expected nothing less. "Good," she said, then glanced briefly at the clock on the wall. "You have about 5 hours before that meeting," she continued. "I suggest you go home, get some rest, and come back ready to explain exactly what you did and why it worked." And Daniel stood up from the chair, the movement feeling different now, less like someone asking for permission and more like someone accepting responsibility. "I will be here," he said, and as he turned toward the door, Victoria spoke. Again, stopping him just before he left. "Daniel," she said, and he paused, looking back. "Do not come in wearing that uniform," she added, her tone not critical, just direct. "You are not walking into that room as a cleaner." And for a brief second, Daniel looked down at the gray fabric of his shirt, the name stitched over his chest, the identity he had been carrying for so long. And then he looked back at her, understanding exactly what she meant, not just about the clothes, but about the role he was being asked to step into. Understood. He replied, and this time when he walked out, it felt different, the hallway no longer just a place he passed through unnoticed, but a path leading towards something uncertain and significant at the same time. As he retrieved his things and stepped out of the building into the cool, early morning air, the sky just beginning to lighten at the edges, he took a deep breath, the kind that filled his lungs completely, because for the first time in years, the future did not feel like something he was chasing just to survive. It felt like something he might actually be stepping into. And as he got into his car and started the engine, there was one thought that stayed with him, simple but powerful, that by the time the sun fully rose, everything about his life could be different. The drive home felt shorter than usual, not because the distance had changed, but because Daniel's mind was moving faster than the road beneath him, replaying every second of the night in sharp detail, the system failure, the risk he took, the way Victoria Hale looked at him not as a cleaner, but as something else entirely, something he had not allowed himself to be in years. And when he pulled into the narrow parking lot of his apartment complex, just as the first light of dawn stretched across the sky, everything around him looked exactly the same. The worn pavement, the quiet rows of cars, the faint hum of early morning traffic in the distance. But he did not feel the same stepping out of his car, because for the first time in a long time, he was not just coming home from work, he was coming back with something uncertain but real. And as he unlocked the door and stepped inside, the soft glow of a small lamp in the living room revealed a familiar scene. A stack of school papers neatly arranged on the table, a half-finished drawing with bright colors, and a small figure curled up on the couch under a blanket. Emily had tried to stay awake for him again, and Daniel felt that familiar mix of warmth and quiet guilt, moving gently so he would not wake her as he set his keys down. But as he approached, her eyes opened slightly, still heavy with sleep. "Dad," she murmured, her voice soft, and he smiled, kneeling beside her. "Hey, kiddo, you should be in bed," he said quietly, and she rubbed her eyes, trying to sit up. "I waited," she said, and there was no complaint in her voice, just a simple statement that carried more meaning than she realized. Daniel adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. "You do not have to do that," he said gently. "I will always come back." And she looked at him for a moment, studying his face in that way children sometimes do, as if they can sense something has changed even when they cannot explain it. "You look different," she said, and that caught him off guard, not because she was wrong, but because she saw it so easily. He let out a small breath, half a laugh, half something else. "Do I?" he replied, and she nodded slightly. "Not tired," she added, and Daniel paused, realizing she was right. The exhaustion that usually followed him home every morning was not there in the same way, replaced by something lighter, something sharper. "Maybe I am not," he said, and for a moment, he allowed himself to just be there, sitting beside her, in the quiet of their small apartment, before the weight of the next few hours returned to his mind. "Hey," he said softly, "I need to go back to work later this morning." And Emily frowned slightly. "But you just got home," she said, and Daniel nodded. "I know, but this time it is different," he explained, choosing his words carefully. because he did not want to promise more than he could guarantee. "I have a meeting," he added, and her expression shifted, curious now. "Like a real meeting?" she asked, and he smiled. "Yeah, like a real meeting." And there was something about saying it out loud that made it feel more real to him too. Emily's eyes brightened just a little. "That is good, right?" she said. And Daniel looked at her, at the quiet trust in her face, the belief that things could change, and he nodded. "Yeah, it could be," he said, and after helping her back to bed and making sure she was comfortable, Daniel moved quietly through the apartment, changing out of his uniform and setting it aside, not throwing it away, not discarding it, but placing it carefully like something that had served its purpose. And as he stood there for a moment, looking at his reflection in the small mirror near the door, he did not see a completely different person, but he did see someone standing at the edge of a different path. And when he finally lay down for a brief rest, the kind that was more about gathering strength than true sleep, his mind did not drift into the usual worries about bills or uncertainty. Instead, it stayed focused on what was coming next, the room, the questions, the expectations, and the chance to step back into a world he had once belonged to, not as who he used to be, but as who he had quietly remained all along. By the time Daniel walked back into the building, the atmosphere had completely changed, the quiet emptiness of the night replaced by the sharp energy of a full workday. Employees moving quickly through the lobby with coffee cups in hand, conversations overlapping, screens lighting up across every floor, and for a brief moment he felt it again, that familiar sense of being out of place. Except this time he was not wearing the gray uniform that had made him invisible. Instead, he wore a simple button-down shirt and dark jeans. Nothing expensive, nothing designed to impress, but clean, intentional, and enough to signal that he was not there to clean anything. And as he stepped toward the elevator, a few people glanced at him without recognition, just another face in the building, and strangely, that gave him a sense of calm, because it meant he could walk into what was coming without expectations from anyone except one person. When the elevator doors opened on the executive floor, the difference was immediate, quieter, more controlled, the kind of silence that comes from focus rather than absence. And just outside the conference room, he could see a group of people already gathered, dressed in tailored suits, their posture confident, their expressions serious, voices low but intense as they discussed system logs and failure reports. And Daniel slowed his steps slightly, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because this was the room Victoria had told him to enter. And these were the people who would question everything he did. One of the men near the door glanced at him briefly, then again, longer this time, as if trying to place him. "Can I help you?" he asked, polite but clearly assuming Daniel did not belong there. And before Daniel could answer, the conference room door opened and Victoria Hale stepped out, her presence immediately shifting the dynamic of the space. Conversations paused, attention redirected, and when her eyes landed on Daniel, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just recognition. "He is with me," she said, and just like that, the unspoken barrier disappeared, not because the others understood, but because she had made a decision, and in this building, her decisions carried weight. Daniel stepped forward, aware of the subtle change in how the others looked at him now, no longer dismissive, but curious, cautious, trying to understand why someone like him was being brought into a room like this. As they all moved inside, the large screen at the front displayed graphs, error timelines, and system architecture diagrams, and Daniel felt something shift again, not external this time, but internal, like stepping back into a space his mind recognized immediately, even if his life had moved far away from it. Victoria took her place at the head of the table, the room settling quickly as everyone waited. "Let us begin," she said, her tone calm but authoritative. "I want a clear breakdown of what happened last night and why our existing protocols failed." And one of the senior engineers started speaking, walking through the data, explaining the sequence of failures, the attempts to resolve them, the limitations they encountered, his explanation precise, technical, and completely aligned with the reports on the screen. But as Daniel listened, he noticed the gaps, the small assumptions that had led them in the wrong direction, the points where they had stopped instead of pushing further. And when the engineer finished, there was a brief pause, the kind that usually signaled agreement, until Victoria spoke again. "You are missing something," she said. and the engineer frowned slightly. "We followed every available path," he replied, and Victoria turned her head slightly toward Daniel. Not dramatically, just enough to shift the focus of the room. "Did you?" she asked, and suddenly every pair of eyes moved to him. The attention immediate, heavy, and Daniel felt it. The pressure, the doubt, the silent question of who he was and why he was there. And for a split second, the old instinct to step back, to stay quiet, surfaced again, but this time he did not follow it. He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady as he spoke. "You followed every documented path," he said, and the distinction was small, but it changed everything, because it pointed directly at what they had overlooked. And as the room went still, Daniel realized that this was the moment that would define whether he truly belonged here or not. Not based on what he had done the night before, but on what he was about to prove now. The room stayed silent for a second longer than expected after Daniel spoke, and that silence was not empty. It was evaluating, recalibrating, every person at the table now looking at him not with dismissal, but with a sharpened focus that carried both skepticism and curiosity. The senior engineer who had been presenting straightened slightly, his expression tightening just enough to show that he was not used to being challenged, especially not by someone whose name had not appeared on any team roster. "What exactly is that supposed to mean?" he asked, keeping his tone professional but edged with doubt, and Daniel did not react defensively. He simply turned his attention to the screen, as if the data itself was the only thing that mattered. "Your logs show repeated authentication failures tied to time discrepancies," he said, his voice calm, measured. "But you treated the time drift as a symptom, not a cause." And a few people in the room shifted slightly, glancing at each other, because that detail had been mentioned, but not emphasized. "It was less than a second," the engineer replied, "within acceptable tolerance," and Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the logic without agreeing with the conclusion. "For most systems, yes," he said, "but not for one that relies on chained verification across distributed nodes." And as he spoke, he stepped closer to the screen, pointing to a section of the diagram where the failure pattern repeated. Each node was rejecting the previous one because the timestamps did not align perfectly, which created a loop. And now the explanation was no longer abstract. It was precise, targeted, the kind that could not be easily dismissed. The engineer opened his mouth as if to respond, then paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked back at the data, because for the first time, he was seeing it from a different angle. Victoria remained silent at the head of the table, watching, not intervening, allowing the moment to unfold on its own, because this was not about authority, it was about proof. Daniel continued, not rushing, not over-explaining, just building the logic step by step. When your team ran standard recovery protocols, the system kept reintroducing the same mismatch, he said. So every fix reset the failure, instead of resolving it. And now a few heads in the room nodded slightly, the pieces beginning to connect. "So what would you have done differently?" another engineer asked, this one less defensive, more genuinely curious, and Daniel met the question directly. "I stopped treating the nodes as independent," he said, "and forced a unified time sync before reinitializing the authentication chain." And there it was, simple when stated clearly, but not obvious until someone pointed it out, the kind of solution that comes from understanding how systems behave under pressure, not just how they are designed to function. The room fell quiet again, but this time it was different, not skeptical, not resistant, but absorbing, processing, and slowly, the shift became visible. The senior engineer leaned back slightly, exhaling as he looked at the screen again, then back at Daniel. "That would have worked," he admitted, and that admission carried weight, because it was not easy. Not in a room like this, not from someone in his position. And Victoria finally spoke, her voice cutting cleanly through the moment. "It did work," she said, and that subtle correction reframed everything. This was no longer a hypothetical discussion, it was a confirmed result, and now the room saw Daniel not as someone offering an idea, but as the person who had already solved the problem they had failed to fix. One of the analysts at the far end of the table leaned forward slightly, studying Daniel with a different kind of interest. "How did you even think to try that?" she asked, and Daniel paused for a brief moment. Not because he did not have an answer, but because the honest one was not technical, it was instinct. Because the system was behaving like it did not trust itself, he said, and a few people exchanged glances at that phrasing, but it resonated in a way pure data could not, because it captured something deeper about how failures cascade. Victoria's gaze stayed fixed on him, steady, assessing, but now there was something else behind it, not just recognition, but confirmation, and as the room settled into a new understanding of what had happened, Daniel realized that the hardest part was not walking into the room. It was standing in it and being seen for what he could actually do. And in that moment, there was no going back to being invisible. The energy in the room had shifted completely now, no longer centered on what had gone wrong, but on the person who had quietly stepped in and corrected it. And that kind of shift was not subtle. It changed how people listened, how they asked questions, how they measured value, and Daniel could feel it in the way no one interrupted him anymore, in the way even the most senior voices paused before speaking, as if recalibrating their assumptions in real time. Victoria let the silence stretch just long enough for that realization to settle across the table before she spoke again. "Let us move forward," she said, her tone steady, controlled. "We are not here to relive the failure. We are here to understand how to prevent it from happening again." And that direction was clear, decisive. It pulled the room out of analysis and into action. One of the engineers nodded, already pulling up a revised system map on the screen. "If we implement a unified time synchronization layer across all nodes, we can eliminate the drift entirely," he said. And this time, instead of presenting it as a conclusion, he glanced toward Daniel, almost unconsciously, as if seeking confirmation, and Daniel gave a slight nod, not authoritative, not dominant, just aligned. "That would stabilize the chain," he said. "But you also need a fallback that does not rely on perfect sync, because no system stays perfect under real conditions." And that addition shifted the conversation again, deeper this time, more practical, more resilient, the kind of thinking that extended beyond solving one problem into preventing the next. Victoria watched closely, not just the content of the discussion, but the dynamics of it. How quickly the room adapted once the right perspective was introduced. How resistance gave way to collaboration when clarity replaced assumption. And after several minutes of back and forth, she raised her hand slightly, bringing the discussion to a stop. "That is enough," she said, not dismissing the ideas, but capturing the moment. "We have direction." And then she turned her attention fully to Daniel, and the shift in her focus was immediate and unmistakable. The room followed it without being told. "Daniel," she said, and his name carried differently now, no longer unfamiliar, no longer out of place. "Everything we discussed today started with you." And she let that statement stand on its own for a second, not as praise, but as fact. "You identified the flaw, you corrected it, and you explained it in a way that moved this entire team forward." And as she spoke, there was no exaggeration, no attempt to elevate the moment beyond what it was, because it did not need that. The reality was already enough. Daniel remained still, listening, not deflecting, not stepping back, just present, and Victoria took one small step closer to the table, her voice steady. But because they understood exactly what that meant, this was not a temporary acknowledgement. This was a structural change, a recognition that could not be ignored or reversed quietly. Daniel felt the impact of her words settle in, not as surprise, but as something heavier, something that carried responsibility as much as opportunity. "You will work directly with this team," Victoria continued, "not as support, not as an observer, but as someone whose input is expected and required." And that distinction mattered, because it defined not just his position, but his voice, his place in the room. She held his gaze for a moment longer, making sure there was no ambiguity in what she was offering. "We will finalize the details after this meeting," she added. And then, just slightly, her tone softened, not in authority, but in acknowledgement. "But understand this, you earned this." And that was the part that stayed with him, not the role, not the title that would come, but the fact that it was not being given out of sympathy or chance. It was being recognized because of what he had done. And as the meeting began to shift toward next steps and implementation plans, Daniel sat there for a moment, taking it all in, the room, the people, the opportunity that had opened in front of him. And for the first time since he had walked into that building the night before, he did not feel like someone stepping into unfamiliar territory. He felt like someone returning to a place he had always belonged. By the time the meeting ended, the room slowly returned to its usual rhythm, conversations breaking off into smaller groups, laptops closing, decisions already turning into action. But for Daniel, everything felt quieter, more focused, as if the noise of the outside world had been turned down just enough for him to finally hear something he had ignored for years. Not doubt, not fear, but clarity. And as he stepped out of the conference room, the same hallway he had walked through countless nights before now felt completely different. Not because it had changed, but because he had. And that difference followed him all the way back down to the lobby, where people moved past him without realizing that just hours earlier, he had been invisible in this very space. And yet now, for the first time, he did not need them to notice, because he knew exactly where he stood. When he stepped outside, the morning sun had fully risen, casting a warm light across the city, and he paused for a moment before heading to his car, taking in a breath that felt deeper than usual, not rushed, not weighed down, just steady. And as he drove home, the streets looked the same, the traffic lights, the storefronts, the familiar turns. But there was a quiet shift in how he saw all of it, not as a cycle he was stuck in, but as a path that had finally opened. When he reached his apartment, Emily was already awake this time, sitting at the small kitchen table with her school backpack beside her, swinging her feet slightly as she waited. And when she saw him walk in, she looked up immediately, searching his face the way she always did. "How was your meeting?" she asked, her voice simple but full of expectation. And Daniel smiled. Not the tired smile he used to give, but something more certain, more real, as he set his keys down and walked over to her. "It went well," he said, and for a moment he considered explaining everything. The system, the meeting, the offer, but then he realized she did not need all of that. She only needed to know what it meant, so he knelt slightly to meet her at eye level. "Things are going to be different," he added, and she tilted her head just a little. "Different good?" she asked, and Daniel nodded without hesitation. "Yeah, different good," he said, and that answer was enough for her, her face lighting up with a small, genuine smile that made everything else feel worth it. Later, after he walked her to the bus stop and watched her climb aboard, he stood there for a second longer than usual, hands in his pockets, the morning air cool but comfortable, and he thought about how close he had come to staying quiet, to walking away from the problem the night before, to choosing safety over action, and how easily none of this would have happened if he had. And that realization stayed with him as he turned back toward his apartment, because it was not just about one decision, it was about what that decision revealed, that the skills he thought he had lost were still there, that the value he believed had disappeared had simply been waiting for the right moment to be seen. And as the days that followed began to take shape, with new responsibilities, new challenges, and a role that continued to grow, Daniel did not try to rush ahead or prove more than necessary. He focused on the same thing that had brought him there in the first place, understanding the problem, thinking beyond the obvious, and acting when it mattered. And Victoria watched that.